can people find love after they've had a loss? That's the topic we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Today I have a new guest on Flourish-Meant. His name is James C. Magruder. He is the multi-published author of essays, articles, and inspirational Christian fiction, including the novels The Glimpse and his recent novel, The Desert Between Us. And that is a story of love after loss and victory over grief. And that's the topic we're going to be addressing today. So I'm glad that you're here on the show today, Jim. Welcome to Flourish-Meant.
Thank you so much, Tina. I'm certainly happy to be here.
So, Jim, can you share with the audience how you became interested in this topic of loss? You come from an advertising and marketing background. So why did you choose to focus on this topic of sorrow? That doesn't seem to be your background. So what turned you toward this very meaningful and much needed topic?
Well, I think what turned me toward it was just my own personal experience. Well, I haven't lost a spouse, which the book is about. My father lost his spouse, my mother. When I was 11 years old, my mother died suddenly from cancer, and my father was left alone to raise 6 children. And so most of my life, ever since being 11 years old, I've wondered about basically the two-question premise of this book, The Desert Between Us. And that is, if you lose your spouse or soulmate prematurely, number one, can you ever love again? Can you ever give yourself permission to love again? That's the first major dramatic question of the novel. The second question is, if you can give yourself permission to love again, can you ever love the same again? And of course, I've watched my father deal with that after the loss of my mother, but I've always wondered about that. What do you have to go through? How do you give yourself permission? And can it ever be the same? Or if once you lost that true soulmate, that true spouse that you loved with all your heart, will you always hold something in reserve for the one lost? That's why I've been carrying this around with me, Tina, for years in my heart, and thought seriously about it the last 10 years, and then wrote it over the last 2 years.
Can you describe for the audience what that journey, that personal journey was like when you were walking through this topic of discovering how to identify with a character who had loss and was seeking the answer to the question, can I love again?
Yes, the character evolved by going through all the stages of grief. And the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. As I was writing the story, I was sort of reliving what was going on, what happened to my father, and that kind of thing. And what I wanted to do was just make it really clear to people that you can recover, you can love again after grief, but it's going to take time. It's going to take giving yourself permission to do that. It's going to take understanding yourself and your feelings. So this main character, what he goes through is he keeps a journal, and that journal explains how he's feeling so that the reader can travel with him through this journey of grief. And by journaling, there's a saying that says, you can heal yourself if you can hear yourself. And by the journaling, he could sort through his feelings, write down how he felt, sort through those feelings then once they were on paper, and then actually cope with them. Because men in particular tend to stuff our feelings instead of vent our feelings. And the journal serves a purpose as a secondary device that I use for him to vent his feelings, share with the audience what he's going through, and help himself figure out how he feels. And he can heal by his own words then, because he can reread them, think about what he's been through, and clearly see a path forward. So that's part of the process.
I love that you did some research and you looked into Kubler-Ross's premises of grief, all the stages of grief, and that you talk about something that is a very powerful therapeutic tool that the audience who's reading this and identifying with this character can either implement themselves if they're experiencing grief, or share with other people that are around them that are going through grief and that don't know what to do. Was that part of the design of this novel, is that you were hoping to come alongside the reader and give them an arm to hold on to as they walk through this journey with themselves or with their friends?
Yes, and I did a lot of research on this, Tina. I did both primary and secondary research. The secondary research was, the Kubler-Ross books, many other books. I read 4 books on grief, so I would really understand it, not speak about it just academically, but also personally, but with a background that had authority. The second thing was primary research, which was interviewing men and women who have lost their spouse to death prematurely. And I sat down with them and did complete interviews on how they felt, how long it took them to recover, when they could decide if they could indeed love again, and then could they love as deeply again. And it was a very interesting process to see what people went through. And the long and short of it was most people will and desire to love again. It's just a matter of timing. And the thing I learned there about grief was grief has no timetable. People come to these conclusions that they can love again on a different timetable. Some may take 2 years as sort of the average. Others took 7 years. So all of that made me feel like what I was about to put on the page would really minister to the reader, because I talked with people who had been through it.
Oh, that's so powerful. Thank you for doing such deep research so that you could be more helpful to the readers that will pick up your book. So talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you found out when you were doing those interviews, other than that generalization that people eventually will be able to love again. Were there other things that you found, other insights that you weren't expecting when you were interviewing people who had gone through loss?
I don't think there was anything that took me by surprise. I think some people were driven more by loneliness and companionship and those needs. Other people, of course, one gentleman at age 31 lost his wife due to the rejection of a heart transplant, and they had 5 children. So he couldn't even give himself permission. That's what came up. I think to answer your question is what came up were things that were confirming to what I already had believed. Like, for example, this idea of permission. People don't just seem to fall in love the second time around. It's more thoughtful. It's more planned. It's more like this permission concept I'm talking about. There has to be like this mental assent that, yes, I'll give myself permission to be open to loving again. And that took him 7 years before he could even consider the question, would I love again? Another thing that he said that I thought was pretty important to me, and maybe somewhat of a revelation, was that he didn't want to marry again just so his children had a mother, because he didn't want his children to be stepchildren. He wanted them to be loved children. And so he had to make sure his new spouse could love those children as much as he could love her. And so those are the kind of things that came up during the process.
So giving yourself permission is really important. And I love that you're bringing that up and that you were being so authentic in this novel. Did you also find that people expressed some heartbreak and pain over the things that people said or did or expected when they were walking through grief that really wasn't helpful and could have been counterproductive? Sometimes even in the church, we'll say things to people like, you should be over it now. You should pull yourself up. You should be done with the grieving. And there's no, just like there's no timetable, there's also no expiration date on grief, especially if you've been with someone for a long, long time, or you shared something truly profound with them.
Yeah, that's another great question, Tina. Yeah, it did come up. Some people told me that people would say to them, God will work together for good, and quoted Romans 8:28. And there would be other things they would say, like, it'll just be a matter of time. God has a purpose in this. All of the things that could be true, but were hurtful and painful at the time, to your point. I guess the advice I got from most of the people, the best thing to do was not to say anything, but to hug them, to love them, to follow up with them. One thing I did personally to a friend that lost his spouse is I said to him, this was about maybe a couple of weeks after the funeral, but I went up to him and I said, hey, listen, I want to make a promise to you. I want to promise you that I will be thinking about your wife anytime you want to be talking about it. And I don't mean just next month or next week. In the years to come, when I know that every day you're still thinking about her, I will be ready to talk about her and to tell you what I remember about her. And he just was so emotional about that because he wanted permission to talk to somebody when he thought everybody else had already forgot about her and moved on, let's say a year later. And it turned out that a year or two later, he'd come to my home and we'd sit down and we'd talk specifically about his wife, because I knew that he'd be thinking about her every single day. And by me bringing it up, in fact, I even told him this, that if you don't mind, I'm going to bring her up to you because I'm not going to be afraid of you being hurt. I'd rather bring her up to you knowing that's what you're thinking about. And then you'll know that I care enough about your loss that we can revisit all the things about Muriel that you loved. And that was actually freeing for him, that somebody could say that and would act on it.
That is so good, Jim. I really appreciate the model of being a good and supportive member of the body of Christ to those who are around us, a good and supportive member of the family of God, to be more specific, to people around us, because we talked about giving ourselves permission to love again after loss. But before you give yourself permission to love again, you have to give yourself permission to grieve, to fully grieve, to be sad. And in the West, in our culture, we don't give people permission to actually be sad and to experience negative emotions.
No, we don't. And that's actually in my notes and everything I did, that when you give yourself permission to grieve, and that actually comes first, you give yourself permission to grieve, and then over time, you can give yourself permission to love again. With men, I think it's particularly difficult. We tend to want to stuff our feelings and not vent. And another thing I talk about in the book, in The Desert Between Us, there's a scene between Chase Kincaid, the main character, and his new love interest. Her name is Sierra Taylor. And they're walking along the beach and they're talking. And he's not quite sure. She challenges him and says, you don't seem to be quite sure whether or not you're still grieving. And he said, well, I'm very functional. I can do everything. I'm keeping the kids on track. I'm doing all these things. You can be functional and still be grieving. When was the last time you had a good cleansing cry? And he had to think about it. He said, well, shortly after it happened, a day or so after it happened, I had this tremendous time where I cried. She said, have you done that since? No. He says, no. And she says, what on earth do you think once is enough? And then I did research on that. And crying on a regular basis during the early grief is actually very cleansing. And men would think once is enough. I never saw my father cry after he lost my mother because he kept it from us. My sisters could hear him crying behind a closed door, but he tried to be strong for us. So, and being a World War II generation man, he tried to show strength by not showing emotion. And so the book's going to talk an awful lot about you can be strong by being weak. And that what I mean by that is you're being strong by being vulnerable. And by being vulnerable, you're a model to your children that it's okay to grieve and it's okay to cry.
That is a really powerful message. And I can't wait to get into more of this in the second half of our conversation. But for now, how can people stay connected with you and get a copy of The Desert Between Us?
Okay, thank you for asking. You can stay connected to me via my email address, jamescmagruder@gmail.com, or my website, jamescmagruder.com. And that way you can message me there, or you can do that. Also, I'm available on Facebook under jim.magruder.35. And the same thing, same address for Twitter or X. And the book is available. Let me tell you where it's available. It's available at Amazon.com. It's also available on Goodreads.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and ChristianBooks.com.
I hope that all of you listening were inspired and encouraged by this message of how you can love after loss. And of course, I also hope that you will hit subscribe and come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.